Welcome to the afternoon session. This is the session on philosophy. Our topic will be how is knowledge established and what constitutes valid reasoning. Our speakers this afternoon are John Durant and Sonam Chopal. The panelists will be Lobsang Gampo and Julie Haas. John will begin.
Thank you, Your Holiness. It's wonderful to be here again and an honor to speak to you and to this audience. I have just had the pleasure of having lunch with you, Your Holiness, and I realize we had a very good lunch. So my problem is great. I have to try to interest you in this difficult hour of the day, and everybody else maybe has had lunch too, so I will do my best. I have been asked to speak to a modest subject, which is, what is science? And I'm going to follow very much the line that Michel Bitpol took this morning, and I would have liked to use the quotation from Albert Einstein with which he began, or with which he almost concluded, namely that if we want to understand science, perhaps we should look at what scientists do, and not quite so much at what they say that they do. And that is going to be the way that I will approach this subject. Scientists, it's true, do a lot of different things. Some are in laboratories, some are out in the field, as you see in this image. Some go underwater, some even send devices to the moon and to other planets. Science involves many different activities. But when we try to understand science as a whole, we find that it's difficult, and that's partly because there are a lot of stories, I will call them myths, about the nature of science, which do not help us. And I'm going to talk briefly about 3 different myths or stories about science, which I think are not very helpful, before I try to summarize what I think would be a more helpful approach. So the first thing I want to talk about is the myth of scientific certainty. And this is the most appealing myth of all, because we all know how powerful and how influential science is. I have in my pocket a medicine prescribed to me on the basis of science, without which I would not survive. So I have to take this every day. I have complete confidence in taking this because I trust that the science on which this is based is correct, and it seems to keep me alive. So I'm grateful. Nevertheless, I still want to suggest no. So you're right. My survival is based on many things, including the excellent food that you give us. But this is one of the things on which, as it happens, my survival is based. I won't go into why, but just to illustrate that we all trust science, or many of us do, a lot. And it's easy to think that perhaps what science tells us is so successful that it must be certain, that scientific knowledge must be beyond dispute. And I want to explain why I think a lot of people feel like that, and also why I think that is wrong. So I will use an example that has been used already in this meeting. This is a portrait of Isaac Newton, perhaps the most important scientist of the 17th and early 18th centuries. Newton is famous for establishing some laws of motion and his principle of universal gravitation. And one of the famous things that his laws do is to explain many different things at once. So in the same principles, he can understand famously how an apple falls on his head and how the moon is held in its orbit around the sun. And it is sometimes said that Newton's principles took men to the moon because the Apollo project had to use Newton's laws of motion to help calculate the path to take. And I believe all that is true. It is also true, however, that we know, and we heard it said this morning, that much later, at just after the turn of the 20th century, Albert Einstein came along and actually reinterpreted some of the same things that Newton had explained through his laws, and he even reinterpreted gravitation. So the thing for which Newton is most famous came to be understood in a quite different way. It turns out that in the everyday world, Einstein's predictions from his theory of gravity are more or less the same as Newton's, so you can still use Newton's laws to go to the moon. But the thing that is interesting to me is that Einstein's principles changed the most basic assumptions about what gravity is. Gravity is not understood in the same way at all in Einstein's general theory of relativity. And many people, including me, have come to feel that if you can change Newton, if in a certain sense Newton can be shown to have been wrong, then anything in science can be shown to be wrong. If we asked a scientist in the 19th century, what is the most certain science you have, they would almost certainly have said Newton's laws. That was right at the pinnacle of science. And yet, now, it's been changed. And this happens Okay. So this happens in many areas, and it happens in quite everyday areas. So I want to use one more example, which is very different from Newton's laws of motion. This is a living thing that many people here may have seen. The English word for this organism is lichen. It can be found growing on trees and on sidewalks sometimes. I looked for some around Mundgod. I hoped to bring some, but I could not find any. I apologize. So why do I show this? Biologists have been taught for many years that lichen is a very unusual living thing because it's made of two other living things that have come together. It's made of a plant which is called an alga, green plants which you can find growing in ponds and all over. And it's a close relationship between an alga and a fungus, a thing more like a mushroom, which come to live in permanent relationship close together. So every textbook of biology on this subject for nearly 100 years has said that that is what a lichen is. Until last year. So last year, this person, a scientist working in America, published a paper with some other colleagues in which they closely studied lichens from many different parts of the world, and they found that there is a third organism. This is not two together. I can't do it. I only have two hands. Three together in this thing. There is also a yeast. The yeast is the microorganism that is well known because it's used in baking bread and so on. So it turns out that we were wrong for almost 100 years in saying that lichens are a symbiosis of two things. It turns out, it seems that all lichens are probably a symbiosis of three things. So this is relatively routine in science, and it is actually seen as a good thing. It means we are improving our knowledge. But the very fact that you improve your knowledge means that you have to hold your knowledge with a certain amount of provisionality. You have to hold your knowledge lightly. You should not grasp it too strongly because it might have to be changed and then you're in trouble. So this is why very distinguished scientists, that's just a quote, we don't need to stop with that. Very distinguished scientists have sometimes observed this. This is the late Richard Feynman, very distinguished American physicist, and he wrote that scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty, some most unsure, some nearly sure, none absolutely certain. So I think this is a very important feature of science. We should forget the myth of scientific certainty. However confident we can be in the claims of science, we always know they can be improved, and they may need to be changed. That's my first point. The second myth I want to look at is the myth of scientific method. And I think I may even disagree with some of my eminent colleagues around the table here. We will find this out in discussion. But I think that some unhelpful things are said about this thing called the scientific method. I just pulled this up off the internet, and here's a set of words that are associated with the notion of scientific method. You will hear people talk often about the scientific method, and they will describe it in different ways, but commonly, this is just one. Again, I pulled this from the internet. There are hundreds of representations of the scientific method on the internet. And you see that it starts with a theory. Sometimes people start with a hypothesis. It makes a prediction. You do an experiment. You make an observation, and you either confirm or you change your theory. And you will hear this said often. You will also see this experimental idea of the scientific method represented in public. So here is an old science fiction movie, if you like. This is Boris Karloff playing the role of Dr. Frankenstein in a Hollywood movie, and he's doing some elaborate experiment. So why would I object to this way of talking about science? My only problem with this is it implies that there is one single unique way of doing science. And I do not accept that. I think if you look at what scientists do, and not just at what they say they do, this is an example where you see that they do many different things, and doing experiments is only one of them. So what about our friends in optical astronomy, who have made huge progress in understanding the nature of the universe by studying the sky at night? But mainly, they have done this by making very detailed, close observation. They can't really do experiments on the stars, not easily. And the same is true in the study of fossils. So paleontologists who've told us a great deal about the history of life on Earth, studying dinosaurs and extinct reptiles and so on, they generally don't use the experimental method. They use other methods. So I would prefer us to start talking about scientific methods rather than the scientific method. And in fact, a number of philosophers have noted that when you look at what scientists do, this is one rather notorious gentleman called Paul Feyerabend. He just is confirming that when you look at the history of science, you find many different methods being used and no conformity to this myth of a single method. Now, my last myth is the most delicate of all, because I want to criticize the myth that scientists I now want to criticize the myth of what I call the objective scientist. You will often hear people, now of course I want to exclude all my colleagues here, the scientists here. They are all exceptional individuals and they are all very objective, Your Holiness. But they are not necessarily typical of all scientists. When we look at scientists as a whole, I don't think we can honestly say that all scientists are completely objective. We have a number of wonderful historical stories which talk about the objective scientist. Here is a portrait of Galileo, the Italian natural philosopher, before the Spanish Inquisition, when he was forced to give up his belief that the Earth goes round the sun. And it is said that he did give up the belief, but then when he left, whispered and in Italian, and yet it moves, and yet it moves. So you can force me to say something different, but I will say the truth, because I'm objective. And we have myths about the objective scientist in science fantasy. So this, for anybody here who has watched Star Trek, is Mr. Spock, who is a member of a species from the planet Vulcan. And this is one quotation from Mr. Spock. "May I say that I have not thoroughly enjoyed serving with humans. I find their illogic and foolish emotions a constant irritant." So this is Mr. Spock in Star Trek plays the role of the objective scientist. He has no emotions, he sees things objectively, and somehow he's pointing out that ordinary human beings don't. And I want to suggest that scientists are ordinary human beings. So scientists, too, have a hard time always being objective. Sometimes they can be, sometimes they are not. I'm going to just use one example from current science. So this is a rather unclear image, but it's about a very important new form of gene editing known as CRISPR. You see the letters CRISPR up there, CRISPR-Cas9. It's a very important discovery of the last few years. And the discovery is associated with several scientists. This is one. This is Professor Eric Lander. I think you have met Professor Lander, Your Holiness, on some previous occasions. And Lander wrote an article recently describing all the different places in the world where research had been done that was important for the discovery of this gene editing technology. But his article provoked outrage, and there has been an extraordinary argument going on. Here is another scientist called Michael Eisen commenting on Lander's article. This is, he says, science propaganda at its most repellent. Eric Lander and the Broad Institute should be ashamed of themselves. Now, why is he saying this? Because there is currently a dispute about who really is responsible and who should take the credit for this important scientific discovery. Priority disputes, as they're called, are very common in science. And it's very rare to see scientists involved in a priority dispute who behave objectively, because their own reputations, their own careers, maybe their students' reputations or their lab. In the case of CRISPR, there's a lot of money involved. There are patents already for this discovery, and people will make millions of dollars out of this discovery. So you don't expect people to behave objectively when careers and wealth are at stake. And indeed, they often do not. So, why are we so subject to myths about science? I want to say there's a very straightforward answer, and it points us in the direction of a better understanding of the nature of science. And for the last few minutes, I will be more constructive. The problem with these myths is that they focus on individual scientists and what they do, their individual methods, and the certainty of the results that come. But actually, if you look at what scientists do, one thing that's immediately obvious is that scientists don't do their work on their own. The notion that science is the result of the work of lone geniuses, very smart giraffes, apparently, this is itself the biggest myth. Science is done by many giraffes working together. And the most distinctive feature of science is that it is a community, just as a monastic community is a community. The scientific community is a community dedicated to producing the best knowledge and understanding that it can of the natural world. So as soon as we look at what scientists do, we see people doing things together, often in large numbers. Here is something that every scientist will recognize. It's a poster session in a big scientific conference. And the people you see, Your Holiness, standing in front of these big posters are junior researchers who are summarizing their work and what they have discovered up to this point on these posters. And people come and they argue about whether this is right or whether that's the right way of doing it or whether it's worth doing at all. This is a very important step in the path of a scientific career. So in closing, I want to suggest that we need to think about science much more as something that is the result of the combined efforts of many people. You don't get science from a single individual on their own, in my view. Scientists are trained just as artisans or skilled workers in any other field are trained. And one thing they're trained in is their responsibility to other researchers. They are responsible for reporting their work as well and as clearly as they can. They're responsible for publishing their work openly. You cannot be a successful scientist in the conventional sense if you do everything in secret. You are responsible also for acting as a critic of other colleagues' work. Every scientist is called upon to, it's called peer review. They're called upon to read the research of their colleagues before it's published and make criticisms if they can see it. And it's through this interplay between a community of knowledge producers that we get the reliability that we so associate with modern science. I trust these pills because, among other things, they have been subjected to very critical scrutiny. Scientists have done experiments, and others have then had to check whether the experiments were true or reliable. And for that reason, I suggest the best way to understand science is to think about it, my first question, as a global culture. It's a culture that stretches right around the world. It takes no notice of people's nationality or their cultural backgrounds. Actually, it takes no notice of their religious beliefs. It simply asks, are you willing to contribute? Are you able to contribute successfully to this culture of creating reliable knowledge about the natural world? Thank you.
Sanam? You guys will.
Yeah. Excuse me. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
PowerPoint? Oh, okay. Use this. Yes. No.
Good afternoon, Your Holiness. For me, doing this presentation in your presence, in the presence of so many renowned scholars and scientists, is the biggest honor for my life. And this was made possible by your constant inspiration and support. And I, on behalf of the whole monastic community of students, would like to express our deepest gratitude and admiration for your profound vision and encouragement. As a new student, I'm bound to make many mistakes in my presentation, so I ask your forgiveness and the forgiveness of my teachers for any limitations on my part in presenting some of the Buddhist ideas pertaining to the theory of knowledge. I think to build a meaningful bridge between Buddhist science and Western science, it is necessary for the two sides to learn about each other's fundamental concepts and defining features. As such, I would try to present some of the basic Buddhist concepts about knowledge, like how knowledge is generated and produced, and how it is validified. As the title suggests, my main topic for this presentation is the Buddhist theory of knowledge, but there are several other points that I would like to talk about in this presentation. So, first, I would like to present a brief outline of Buddhism. We have among the audience people from many different intellectual, cultural and religious backgrounds, and such an outline, I think, may provide them with helpful information in understanding our subsequent talks. I also hope that it will provide a basis for our discussions that are followed. So, about the introduction of the Buddhism, a brief introduction of Buddhism, I would like to start it with a question, and the question is, what is Buddhism? So this is a big question, and there are, of course, many ways to answer this question. And till today, different scholars have tried to answer this question in their own ways. Your Holiness, you have been teaching us about Buddhism having three components, namely Buddhist religion, Buddhist philosophy, and Buddhist science. And our understanding is it is the last two components of Buddhism that are the Buddhist philosophy component and Buddhist science component that are comparable with Western science. During the subsequent sessions, my fellow monastic presenters will be talking about several topics, primarily drawn from Buddhist science. And so, I'm sorry. I would like to address the question, what is Buddhism, based on one of the most oftenly quoted verses from a sutra. Buddha says that his teachings are all geared towards taming our mind. He says, I quote, do not commit any non-virtue, cultivate virtues to the utmost. Tame one's mind to the fullest. This is the teaching of a Buddha. The first two lines of this verse deal with the two fundamental points of Buddhist philosophy, and the third line is about taming our minds through methods of contemplative practices, which is a primary point in Buddhist science, I think. A state of fully tamed mind is the state of Buddhahood, which primarily is dealt with in Buddhist religion component. So in this short verse, the Buddha has already taught us about the three different components of the Buddhism. So if taming of our mind is what Buddhism is all about, then how do we achieve that? How should we approach our world so as to achieve that? Taming one's mind is possible only by eliminating the different types of inflictive emotions, which are rooted in the ignorance of reality. So to dispel this ignorance, one needs to do thorough and reliable inquiries. So this leads me to the method of doing inquiry in Buddhism, which involves what are known as the four reliances. The four are rely on the teachings, not the person, rely on the meaning, not just the words, rely on the definitive meaning, not the provisional word, rely on the exalted wisdom, not the ordinary thoughts. So, since we should rely on the teaching, not on the person, we must investigate if what the person or the master has taught is in accordance with the reality, which means not accepting the teaching merely out of faith or respect. As such, a master's words should be put under thorough investigation. And only if one has a sound reason or evidence to establish a point, then, only after then, the point is accepted in Buddhism. Buddha himself has taught us not to accept his words merely out of faith or respect for him, but rather put them under three different investigations. In one of his teachings, the Buddha said, just as a goldsmith assays or checks gold by rubbing, cutting, and burning, so should you, my followers, examine my words. Do not accept them just out of respect for me. So this shows the value of empirical investigations in finding the truth. As such, I think these methods, the Buddhist methods of inquiry, resonates very well with the scientific method or scientific methods, as John would put. And all the above mentioned theories are used for the sole purpose of gaining knowledge of the world or of the reality. And the concept of knowledge, in my opinion, is a point where Buddhist science and Western science diverge fundamentally. In Western science, as we have just heard from Professor John Durant, knowledge is always uncertain and falsifiable. But on the other hand, in the Buddhist science, as we see in these citations, knowledge is asserted to be certain and infallible. So I hope during the panel, after this presentation, there will be discussions regarding how to approach such divergent points between these two different traditions, namely Buddhist science and Western science. So, Acharya Dignaga and Dharmakirti, two of the greatest Buddhist masters, describes two aspects of the infallible nature of knowledge. Infallibility in terms of fulfilling one's short and long-term purposes, and infallibility in terms of eliminating ignorance of the real nature of phenomena. As such, by means of infallible knowledge, one should achieve one's purposes. As to what purposes one could have, three domains of knowledge are discussed in the Buddhist texts. The three Buddhist texts, the three are. So this picture I put it there to give a very simple example of how an infallible knowledge is necessary to achieve one's purpose. So when we see, it's animated but it's not working, but when we see the first jar of what you call it, Nutella, and a person who really like Nutella would go approach that and try to pick it up, but in reality that's a drawing of a jar of Nutella. So that's a simple. I think it's a too simplified example, but it's I'm trying to show how this infallibility nature is important in achieving one's purpose. So yeah, and in Buddhism, there are three domains of knowledge, which are the manifest object. Manifest object, slightly hidden, and extremely hidden domains. The first two domains of knowledge could be subject. Thank you, Mark. The first two domains of knowledge could be subjects of scientific investigation, but the third domain is as His Holiness always teaches us, is the investigative subject of Buddhist religion only. I do not know how relevant it is here, but in our community here, the notion that Western science deals only with the first type of domain of knowledge, which is the manifest objects, is very pretty common here, that notion. So I hope that through dialogues such as this one, we eliminate such minor and other major misunderstanding of each other and be more appreciative of each other. Yeah. Now that I've talked about a little bit about the concept of an infallible knowledge and its three objective domains, I would like to talk a little bit about the two types of knowledge that are defined in Buddhism and how they are engaged, how they engage with their objects. The two types of knowledge are the knowledge that is direct perception and inference. The other one is inferential knowledge. Yeah, sometimes they translate it as inference and sometimes inferential knowledge. So I'm using the inferential knowledge, the term here. Direct perception is defined as, okay, I'm on the right slide. Direct perception is defined as a non-conceptual, non-distorted consciousness. Inferential knowledge is a conceptual consciousness derived from sound reasoning. And so there are two ways in which knowledge engages, these two different types of knowledge engage with their objects. These two ways are inclusive engagement and exclusive engagement. Direct perception, engages with its knowledge, with its object inclusively, meaning that it does not engage selectively or by way of separating the objects into parts. Whereas inferential knowledge is a conceptual thought which engages with its object exclusively. Conceptual thoughts need a generic image, which is in Tibetan is Tuinji, a generic image of their objects as a medium of engagement with their objects. And I'm sorry, I forgot to do it. Now, let me go back. Earlier, we defined the direct perception as a non-conceptual, non-distorted consciousness, and that definition was of two parts. And now let me go back to the second part of the definition of direct perception, which is no-distortedness. In general, there are two types of causes of distortion. There are the circumstantial cause and the deep-seated cause of distortion. The five sensory consciousnesses are distorted by circumstantial cause of distortion. An example would be the perception of movement of trees and houses when one is traveling in a vehicle, in a train. And the last part of my short presentation, the last point I would like to talk about the line of reasoning from which inferential knowledge is derived. Buddhist epistemology asserts that an infallible inferential knowledge is generated only by a sound reason, which is defined as a line of reasoning which fulfills three modes. The establishment of the concept of perversion is possible only if one is able to establish a necessary connection or a relation between the reason and the predicate. Ajaya Dharmakirti says, says, I quote, "There must exist a viable relationship or a necessary connection wherein the absence of one necessarily entails the absence of the other. Until this is the case, the reason cannot ensure the reason." And the Buddhist epistemology asserts the existence of two types of necessary connections, or the two different types of relations. It also asserts that because there exists a necessary connection between fire and smoke, the existence of fire pervades the existence of smoke, and therefore smoke could be a sound reason to infer the existence of fire. I'm talking about this the necessary connection between this the fire and smoke, because yesterday the philosophy group, we had a meeting in the afternoon, and we talked about this causal relationship between fire and between fire and smoke, and also we talked about the and I thought this could be a really interesting topic for this afternoon's the panel discussion. So I'm mentioning this here. So, and so that's all I have to say. And thank you very much, Your Holiness. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, our two panelists will now make short remarks. Lobsang will begin.
Your Holiness, I would like to take this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude from my heart, and it is an honor for me to be in front of you and to highlight some of the potentially interesting topics that my fellow colleague had just presented on, and I also would like to extend these questions to the larger audiences that have gathered here today. Before going that, I would like to go into some of the historical points of Indian Pramana theory. So some of the Indian Pramana theorists, earlier Pramana theorists, had different views on reasoning. Some Indian schools asserted only one type of knowledge, which is the direct perception. They did not believe in inference. They said that, some of them said that inference is like a blindly walking on a dangerous path. And the absolute knowledge, some of the schools asserted that the absolute knowledge is the what they call Vedic texts, the things that are written in the Vedic texts. But later Pramana theorists asserted that there is second type of knowledge, inference, and later on Buddhists developed their own theory of inference. And as my colleague presented earlier, Buddhist theory of inference is based on three modes of investigation, which are the property of the subject, the forward pervasion, and the counter pervasion. And I would like to focus on the last two part of this three modes, which is the forward pervasion and the counter pervasion. And this leads to some of the points that Dr. Durant made during his presentation, which is the uncertainty of scientific knowledge. And before going that, I'd like to make a little clarification on the meaning of the word certainty, and what we use in Tibetan language as sometimes we use it melua or infallibility, or sometimes we refer to as nyeba, tsiming nyeba, or which is roughly translated as certainty, but this is I want to leave as an open discussion because in Tibetan nyeba, does it really necessarily exclude all the possibilities that it might be wrong, or does it mean like the highest probability, or like maybe 80% or 90%? So here we talk about probability, which was never mentioned in Buddhist epistemology. And I would like to raise some of the potentially interesting questions for the larger gathering of the monks around here, that regarding the last two modes, which is the pervasion, and so positive pervasion means that you have to establish certainty between evidence, you have to establish pervasion of the evidence over predicate in order to establish a general law of phenomena. So for example, if you want to know that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, you have to establish the pervasion of conditioned phenomena over impermanent. And in that case, there was a great discussion and debate between different Pramana theorists, between Buddhist Pramana theorists and earlier other schools, and as well as some other Buddhist schools as well, whether you have to check each and every evidence to establish the pervasion of evidence over predicate. And some of the schools said that yes, you do have to establish, you do have to check each and every case of evidence to establish the pervasion. However, Dignaga and Dharmakirti came up with a new idea that you don't have to check each and every case of evidence in order to establish the pervasion of evidence over predicate. For example, if you want to establish that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, do you have to check each and every case of conditioned things? For example, if you want to establish, a good example we talked about yesterday was a circle. So let's take an example of science. So in order to establish that circle has a ratio to its diameter as 3.14 and etc., do you have to check each and every circle to establish this pervasion, or is there some other way to establish? And Dignaga and Dharmakirti seems to have come up with this new idea that no, you don't have to check each and every case, but by establishing the relation between evidence and predicate, you can probably not 100% certainty, but maybe a high level of certainty of pervasion over the pervasion of the evidence over predicate. So for example, without checking each and every case of conditioned phenomena, you can establish pervasion of all conditioned phenomena over the predicate, which is impermanent. And I would like to open this point as an, I would like to leave this point as an open discussion, and please join us. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Julie Haas.
Thank you. So I think what I'm going to try and do is bring a little bit of clarity to some of the concepts that we've talked about. I think if we're going to compare Buddhist and Western notions of inference and pervasion and certainty and reliability, then we have to get a little bit clearer sometimes about what we mean by those. And I thank my colleagues for what they've said so far. I'm going to focus on the scientific notions of certainty and reliability. So to that end, I'd like to raise a couple of questions and also make some suggestions. So my first question that I think we should clarify a little bit, and hopefully we can do that in the discussion, is what we mean by reliability. So Professor Durand argued convincingly, I think, that science is not in the business of producing certain knowledge, but is in the business of producing reliable knowledge. And I think that's a pretty straightforward claim that we can all accept. I think I would wager that many scientists would agree about the certainty claim, and many philosophers would agree with that as well. But I don't think we want to leave it there. I think we need to know a little bit more about what we mean by reliable knowledge. It's a very loaded term, and if we're going to compare it to degrees of knowing and degrees of certainty in Buddhist knowledge, we need to be quite clear about what we mean when we say that scientific knowledge is reliable. And you can mean a lot of different things by that, and I won't get into those there, but I think I want to suggest and I want to press a little bit the idea that reliability has something to do with, if not knowing what is right about the world or true about the world, there is a sense that scientists are on the right track, that we're heading in the right direction. And if that's right, if there is a sort of truth aspect or a right aspect to science, the second important question is, what is it about science that gives it this reliability? And obviously we're going to have to flesh it out much more, but what I want to focus on is, what is it about science that gives it this sense that we are on the right path, that our theories are getting better? And here I'm going to actually kind of spend most of my time defending the scientific method, because I think it's true that there are lots of different techniques in science. Some scientists go underwater, some scientists look into space. But I would argue that what all scientists have in common, and even cognitive scientists or philosophers who are interested in science have in common, is commitment to the scientific method, which I would describe in the following way. And we saw a chart of that, which is something like generating theories, deriving predictions from those theories, and then testing them either by using experiments or through other means of observation. And I think actually all scientists, I would argue, have that in common. They have that commitment to observation, or what I would call prediction, and then sort of error updating, right? We interact with the world to try and see whether our predictions about the world are right. Now, I would grant that there are scientists in the world who developed theories and were never able to test them, either for pragmatic reasons or political reasons. So not every scientist is able to develop a theory and test it and then update it, right? And conversely, there are also scientists, there are famous cases of scientists who made critical observations about the world. And here I'm thinking about Tycho de Brahe, and I'd like to thank Dr. Aaron Bonning for sort of fact-checking me on this one, who made really important observations, astronomical observations, without necessarily having the Kepler model of the solar system in mind. And so despite having the theory, despite trying to bear out his own theory, his observations were then used to bear out an independent theory. And so it's true that in individual cases, observation and theory can come apart, but I think the broader scientific project, and I think what does grant science that particular power, is that sort of ongoing relationship between predictions, errors in our predictions, and then updating our predictions forward, and that's kind of what keeps us on the steady path. And I think for a philosopher, if what we want to do is to sort of harness science, I think philosophers share this a little bit with Buddhism, in that we see our domain as a little bit broader. So as a cognitive scientist and as a philosopher, I want to not only understand how things work, but I want to sort of use and abuse that knowledge of how things work to my own ends, maybe to tame the mind or to live a better life, then I think it's really important to understand exactly what makes science that powerful. And I think that is, in fact, the scientific method, which is then carried out by communities of scientists. But there's something really special about that kind of carving at the joints. So, thank you.
Now, Your Holiness, I have an apology. It was my mistake. I said we had two panelists. We have three panelists. Our third panelist is Sonam Wanchak. Please.
Good evening, Abchola, Kushang and Butone. I have feeling at the moment there's two presidents. One is Dr. Durant, or one is scholar Sonam. Maybe what I have feel is like a little bit misunderstanding. I feel a little bit contradiction between Buddhist epistemological system and scientific method or scientific knowledge. As you mentioned, Doctor, in your paper yesterday, I read full paper which is sent by the Carol Beck. Also, in this in the paper you mentioned there, if we say the scientific knowledge is certainty, this is misunderstanding. Am I right? If we say the scientific knowledge is a certainty, then is it become the misunderstanding? No? Someone said the scientific knowledge is unchangeable, like say very...
I'm saying that you should be worried if anybody claims that a piece of scientific knowledge is completely certain and can never be revised. I would say you should worry about that.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, right. Also in the motion, the Carol mentioned the science is always question, not answer. Like this is a very good summarize, I thought. So through Buddhist epistemological system, do we have hope to get scientists to the valid cognition, or in Sanskrit called Pramaya? I think, for my feeling, I think it's not possible to get scientists to get a valid cognition through the scientific method because they're always changing, not rely on the So I feel like this. So can you say something? Something about this? So last, let me request you one during. Do you have example, specific example? You say there's some scientists. They even though we called the scientists, but they did not do experiment. Do you have some?
Do we have examples of what?
Scientists, those kind of scientists, they did not any experiment, but we call those who are scientists.
Yes. Yes, there are lots of scientists who've had whole careers and they've never done an experiment in their lives.
Wow.
Yes, and there are others who do nothing but experiments. They do experiments every day. You have everything in between these two.
Usually the monks, or for me also, anyone who is scientist, the scientist must come through the experiment, analysis. But you say there's a scientists, those kind of scientists did not do any experiment, is it?
Well, I'm just trying to say that depending on which subject you are interested in, you have to pick a method that suits your subject. So if you're studying the extinction of the dinosaurs, which we believe happened about 65 million years ago, you may do all kinds of things that don't require experiment. You may need to go and collect evidence or compare data from around the world. That's just one example. So methods are developed by scientists to suit the problem that they study. They don't simply go to a book and say, I must use this method. No, that's not how scientists behave.
Thank you. Here's my own.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much. I think you have pointed out one of the central issues in the intersection or the contact between the epistemology that is part of science and the epistemology that Buddhism has developed. And that is, I can put the question as, does valid recognition require certainty? Or can we get some valid cognition without certainty? Because it seems like science clearly, I think it's indisputable among scientists and philosophers of science for the most part, that science will not yield certainty. Whatever our conclusions are, even our most firm conclusions, it's possible, in fact, we will continue to try to find ways in which we might undermine them. So I think the first topic to breach here is, what do we mean by certainty? What sort of certainty might Buddhist epistemology require, or I think that was nicely raised by Lobsang's remarks. Can we back off Dharmakirti, the stronger claims Dharmakirti makes, or not, right? And then, what does certainty amount, or we have knowledge that comes short of certainty in the sciences. What does that amount to? How strong is it? What is the reliability or not? I think that's a central set of questions in the contact between Western science and Buddhist epistemology. The floor is open.
Yeah. So I would like to go on a little bit on what we mean by uncertainty of scientific theories. And when scientists usually say scientific theory, they usually mean some maybe formula or some kind of law that applies to all the things. For example, let's take an example of gravity force, which is force equals m1 times m2, some constant over r squared, right? So once you establish this formula, then it means it applies to all masses. So this, I think, resonates what we were talking about as the three modes of pramana, inference, which is the pervasion. So pervasion means so you can apply to all cases. But clearly, according to physics, you cannot check each and every case of mass, right? But however, you can have pretty higher level of confidence and certainty in this formula, because as far as the experiments are concerned, it works pretty well. But of course, you cannot have 100% certainty that one day one type of mass will not follow this law, does not apply. This law will not apply to one individual case. So in Buddhist, but in order to establish this law, you start with limited number of examples, limited number of sample. And investigating limited number of sample, you are able to establish this law. And the way science does this investigation is mostly by inductive reasoning. And I would like to talk a little bit more about inductive reasoning and association, correlation and association. Right? And so according to so some of the methods that scientists use when they establish certain law is by observing a limited number of samples and applying it to general cases. And I would like to talk a little bit about associations. So according to statistics, there are 4 types of association. One is spurious association, where you have two phenomena associated with each other, but does not necessarily have a causal connection, but have common cause. And the second type of association is statistical interaction, where one cause affects the result, but the third type of cause, when you control for the third type of cause, the effect changes. And this fourth type. Okay. And then then there's a multiple cause, which are statistically independent. 2 causes can have effect on the result. And my question would be, can we use this type of inductive reasoning to establish maybe some of the theories in Buddhist epistemology as well? So, thank you.
Did you want to?
I just wanted to make a comment on one aspect. I'm not able to comment on whether we can use those principles of statistical reasoning applied to Buddhist philosophy, but I am interested in the fact that scientists have so much confidence in the generality of their conclusions. So having measured the behavior of objects under gravitational fields, most scientists are quite happy to then say, to generalize and say that this will always be the case in all times and places unless there's some other intervening variable. And I think myself that this is an example of an assumption or a guiding principle that scientists bring to their work. And the principle is we believe that nature acts consistently with itself. We do not believe we live in a kind of chaos. If we had one of those figures that His Holiness was referring to over lunch, one of these demonic, powerful figures who came in and fiddled with nature all the time and changed the rules, the kind of science we do would become impossible. I mean, you just would not be able to establish any reliable general conclusions. And science is really committed, before it ever enters the laboratory or the field, it's kind of committed to the notion that we live in a cosmos and not a chaos. So it's an extra scientific principle that I think helps science to get where you say it goes.
Can I add a few words? Yeah. When I think, in a certain way, that the point, the argument between this uncertainty and certainty, I think in Buddhism also we say, all of us agree that this is a taboo. We all agree 100%. Right? But in Buddhism, when you talk about the perversion, but still the possibility of this not being what you call it, taboo is also possible. The possibility is there, right? So although the certainty of this being a taboo is there, but the possibility is also there that not being certainty. So I think it's a little bit of what do you call it, a semantic problem.
So certainty. So one of the questions is, what does certainty mean? Julia, please.
Can I just ask a question after you say what you were going to say?
Well, I was going to. The question of what certainty means. One way in which certainty gets conceptualized is infallibility. It's impossible for me to be wrong, which was in the translation of the. Do you think, Sonam, that the inferences have to be such that it's impossible the conclusions are wrong given the premises? Because what I'm hearing from Lob saying is that a pervasion, and Sonam as well, it has to be very reliable, trustworthy, but not to the point where it's impossible that I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's the question.
That's the question.
Left
Yeah.
open to for discussion. Yeah, but in some of the texts they say. So generally,
exceptions are always there.
Exceptions are always
So
there.
it's not infallibility. All right, Julia.
I have the same question kind of in reverse. So valid cognition or infallible knowledge, we have that in the West too. We often associate it with mathematics. We talked about that a little bit last night. But we think of the domain of valid cognition as very narrow then. So definitely maybe in math, probably not about the natural world, and almost certainly not about our inner lives. So can you say a little bit about what you take in Tibetan Buddhism as the domain of valid cognition? Because I think that would help many of us get a sense of how strong the certainty has to be, kind of as a counterexample.
Actually, let you guys have it. Is there a domain where it has to be without doubt, or is in all reasoning, is it possible to have a doubt about the conclusion given the truth of the premises?
I'd like to clarify a few things. So the very word pramana, which is tsama in Tibetan, and the Sanskrit word pramana means actually to know or to measure rabda jawa.
I think it's very similar to Dr. Dore. You mentioned completely certain knowledge. It's similar with the Buddhists use this term valid cognition.
But but the question is, does it really mean that excluding all the possibilities of that this might be wrong? So that's the question. But firstly, I would like to highlight a little bit on this term. So pramana means to know or to measure. And there's another term called pramaya, which is the object of the pramana. And that applies to essentially all phenomena. So I would say that either through direct knowledge or either through inference, if anything exists, it must be the domain of inference or domain of direct perception. However, the way we establish something through inference may differ according to what types of phenomena are we talking about. So my colleague talked about the 3 different domains of pramaya, which is the manifest pramaya, slightly manifest pramaya, and slightly hidden pramaya, and very hidden pramaya. And according to the text, manifest things can be discovered through direct perception. Slightly hidden objects can be discovered through inference. And the very hidden things can be discovered by what we call maybe a common language would be third reliable source. Yeah, what's being told, yeah.
Oh, so there's a social dimension to that. Interesting.
I wanted to take it in a slightly different direction, maybe, and into the really real world, the gritty world. John made a convincing case that the objective science as an individual is a myth, but what we're seeing in the Western world is an attack on science as the culture of science. In other words, the objectivity of the enterprise is being questioned, and the veracity of it. And that's a different level of suspicion and skepticism of science that's quite dangerous. So in a world where we're more and more tightly bound and underpinned by technology and science, we see most of the Western countries retreating from including science in their decision-making. Less than half of the OECD countries have a science representative at the cabinet level. So I think this is a problem because, if we lose the enterprise as a whole, if it's considered tainted, despite the fact there may be individuals who have biases or political beliefs or opinions, then that's a problem. And I want to pay incredible acknowledgement to you, Your Holiness, because if I asked how many other former heads of state and current leaders of a major world religion would be so strongly supportive of science anywhere else, I know the answer is this answer. So it's a problem, I think. And I'll just give one example just to make it a little more cutting. Most people are ignorant of because of deficiencies in science education, the fact that scientists don't have seats at the table, of the incredible advances in genetics in the last few decades. And then, on the other side, we live in a world where there's huge amount of discrimination, prejudice, leading to killing based on race and culture. But this genetics research has told us that if we took some of His Holiness's DNA and compared it to someone born in the same small Tibetan village you were, the genetic difference is larger than between your DNA and my DNA, a Scottish person, a Caucasian, which belies the whole issue of race and culture as being of any importance in biology. But most people are ignorant of this, and so they discriminate, and there's prejudice, and there's killing. And so science has an obligation to be in this conversation vigorously, and also to push back against being marginalized in the political discussions.
대체 저거 쏠 가래다. I believe science. I often use telling, I am half Buddhist monk, or maybe some add Buddhist philosopher. One is half scientist. So the politicians or in politics, I think they simply carry activities according to their own vision, their own wish. So irrespective whether realistic or not. So that's why there are so many sort of conflict. I think scientists, genuine scientists, open-minded, and then you see anything remain more skepticism. Then investigate. So through investigation, you will understand the reality. And also, I often used to telling the way to research. Also, you see, we should follow 3 dimension, 4 dimension, 6 dimension, in order to know the reality. Just from 1 dimension, you cannot see the reality. Without knowing the reality, your effort become unrealistic. So many politicians, I think they want something very big, but often fail because their method is unrealistic. I think politicians or even religious person pursue their own sort of, a profession. More scientific way, it automatically become more realistic. So that's my view. Then I think tunjolo tongzam, medunchola matongzam se kanstiuka. Sadala kyuda. tunjolo tongzam, medunchola matongzam.
For example, if you use this logic of proving any condition phenomena as impermanent, and then you take an example and simply seeing something in the example which is conciliatory to what you want to establish, and then simply because of that you say that everything is correct, and then simply contrarily, if you have not seen the similar example on the contrary example, and because of that you deny that completely, then that becomes a kind of biased approach.
세상은 안 좋아한다. 초수 지적 독적 수준에 녜봐 사지. 즉 등교 봐. 그 계속 쉬우셔도 봐. 당연히 녜봐서 해야 돼.
예측 야탐바.
당내 아주 사람 단어다. 맞지 된 거다. 체면 슝기. 유기 남자 땅을 파괴하기. 땅을 파괴하기. 유코라. 랑생이 주고 시샤. 랑생시. 그다. 다 정신 매번 마에 루구톤에 마샤나 안다 랑생세하고 안다 ngo보랑세 전도 때문에 튼지 딱버지서 구조 때문에 튼지세야 그 랑생되다 타녀도 랑생 미시베 우모베 루기 각제 랑생데 찍고 차도 해지 찍고 쳐요. 자 근데 인도산에 랑생스럽도 간다 민국왕의 여성신 멤버 유중은에 딱든 째네 막 그로바 째인도선에 군이규도 시샤지 셰고 그 디디는 것도 대과지샤 자상가 참말로 못 추이셔 거서 아주 순구야리 야 참말로 추이셔 샤용구야리 콜이야 랑선 나와도 추이셔 샤제 근데 인도선에 유리야 능유 송유 아니 가는 주유진 되게 야와 먹고 치체 직시행구도 같은 저상간수 즉 자유도산에 나연디 타녀도 랑생 미시비 따외 토네 디도 송윤도 타르도나 다 작배관의 여버지 샤야 마도 그봐 고파 딱는 전에 tangi 뭐네 베프게 왜 자지 자다 봐 거르게 거래 인루로 랑센로 되지 샤야 패치 가오래 되는싱데 남자싱데 남자시베 남도 이와 뭐인싱 달래 현도 저거 지된 작배관의 여버 있었다 타녀도 여버 셋다 지된 작배관의 샤들이 마도 유유 두술로 딱는 전에 그다 참아 루미 전시 봐서 유랑생 레밀루에 가는 시야지 또 가오요래 세상 아주 저 인도자네 그것을 지금 조조스 사람 내가 설을 저도가 딱 코프게 더랑생지 요 말왔다 딱 매매의 말에 요리 편윤지기 요리 이니 예배 예상을 놓고 다녀도 작업원에 여더라 다 상도시면 나송샤야 돼 다녀도 예봐 다녀도 작업 임바 작업들로 다녀배 사무실이 면허봐 딱 대섬식 간에 시행도 와 좋아 다 대가는 내배직이 중대왕 다시베 저체되니 다녀도 작업 다녀배 사무실이 내면 그 시행도 말이지 근데 단담 지식이 기기냐 면허봐서 그게 시행고요 알고 상하들이 챔버리 되게 아주 공부식 시행수 가래 조수부터 저 타만 가서 직 시행수 yes. 가르쳐 주고 the English 사람은 biological DNA and the chromosome or some other things.
And the fact that modern biology research has proven that prejudice based on race or culture is
Yes.
meaningless.
One my friend now no longer living Boston, sorry. Livingston. Oh. You see, once he told me, you see, 7 billion human beings, 7 billion different chromosomes, genome or something. Oh, he mentioned. But these, I think, physical level, yes, there are very subtle level differences. But then these different sort of very, very small subtle thing combined, then gradually this brain formed. Then the consciousness or mind, you see, not a single brain carry activities, but combinedly. So in that level, I think 7 billion human beings, I think more or less, I think same. I feel like that. So I think the people who more sort of say civilized, I can say civilized nations, people who come from more civilized, and my own small village, very uncivilized. But brain is, I think, should be same. So one occasion in Africa, South Africa, the Soweto town, Soweto, they're mainly black African. So I want to visit one black African's home. And then the organizer arranged, you see, that sort of a meeting. So in the family, I often used to telling that story. In that family, say one family member, he introduced me. He working teacher. So in our conversation, I told them, now South Africa, you get democratic constitution. So constitutionally, you have equal right. Now it may take time. You see, the reality, you become equal. For that, you have to work hard. Then that person, you see, who as a teacher told me, oh, we black African cannot compete with white people. Our brain is inferior. Then I argue, this is absolutely wrong. If we go together to a brain specialist, any differences about brain due to color, they will say no. And then also I sort of explain, in Tibet, we Tibetan, some narrow-minded, hardliner Chinese, they consider Tibetan brain is backward. So then, we Tibetan, only question of sort of opportunity. When Tibetan also you see get the same opportunity, we also can be top. So I explain these things. Then lastly, a long sigh, he responded. Now he convinced we are same. At that moment, I really sort of feel immense sort of relief. At least I change one person's sort of mental attitude. If you yourself consider inferior, then there is no possibility to further develop. So therefore, logically, a person who suggests other person, we are same. So I also believe we are same. Then cultural heritage, culture samarve, culture. These not a biological factor. I feel environment and the climate. So like more the Arab countries or say the less vegetation, dry climate. So according to that environment, and India and China and Tibet and Mongolia, I think Mongolia and Tibet, I think even before Buddhism reached, I think we have a common sort of heritage somewhere, common life. We are nomad, particularly northern Tibet. I think very similar, that of Mongolian, with some animal and eating meat and go here and there. Whenever some obstacle come, crash. There's, I think, over 3,000, I think 4,000 years, I think we have that kind of common. So at that time, no national boundary. It's a nomad people go here and there. So I think in cultural heritage, I think many Mongolian cultural heritage, you see, in Tibetan culture also there. We are very similar. And then most important, I think one important is the birthmark, kasatimit, blue. Blue. Birthmark, Mongolian and Tibetan, and Japanese also. Common. Surprisingly, Hungarian, I was told some common sort of mark there. I don't know what is the reason. No? So in any way, so the different culture heritage, culture not taught by someone, not as a religion, but culture also
it's a natural kind of outcome of a people.
So the mainly environment. Because of that way of life, certain things, that eventually create certain sort of unique cultural heritage on that area. Then eventually people call there's this nation's culture, that nation's culture. The language, I don't know. We need further investigation. Linguistics. Like that. So that's my view. But in any way, I think, practical level, we have to emphasize sameness of humanity. That's important. So scientists certainly can help, can support that. There's different people, different color, different system, not much matter. We are same human being. same desire to be happy person, happy community. Okay.
Thank you. So, once again about certainty. John said indeed that many statements of science are uncertain. But on the other hand, science remains, and I think John also agrees, the best possible basis on which to act. And therefore, the people, and why? Because, in fact, there is all this work of collective improvement and mutual criticism that makes science the best possible basis for any successful interventions. So the people who say that because of the uncertainty of science, then we should not use science for action are completely wrong. So I agree also with you.
Could I just respond to that?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah.
So I wanted to say something similar, if I might, about what Chris said, because Chris knows, I agree, and I think everybody around this table agrees, it's very important that we use science and the best scientific advice we can get for a multitude of purposes, whether it be medicine or the conduct of national life. And it is true that some Western countries are pushing science down in terms of its status and how much leaders are willing to listen, and that is not a good thing. I would just point this out, that I don't think we will help our cause, though, if we, and I don't think Chris was implying this, but I don't think we will help our cause if we come forward and make unrealistic claims about science. We must come forward, as Michel just said, and say, science is going to give you the most reliable, the best advice there is available on, for example, climate change. You know, climate change is such a good case where, unfortunately, the United States has proved very reluctant to accept scientific advice on climate change. And you'll hear some of the skeptics say, well, they can't be certain, or there is some room for error in their predictions. And they say this as if this means the science is useless, whereas scientific predictions about climate are bound to have error within them. They're bound to make estimates and use probability. It doesn't mean that you should ignore the advice. It means you should understand that the advice has some error bars incorporated in it. And we need to cultivate a better understanding in that sense of what the scientific advice actually is.
Michel wanted to finish his, and
I do the
go ahead.
Last remark. It's about Sonam's intervention. You very well listed the conditions for inference, the three conditions for inference, and especially presence in similar types and absence in dissimilar types. So, you know, at the beginning of the history of Western science, at the beginning of the 17th century, there was a scientist and a philosopher called Francis Bacon, and he made exactly the same statements. Presence, he called that the tables of absence and presence. And these methodological statements are considered as the introduction to modern science. So the rules of inference of Buddhism are amazingly similar to the beginning of Western science. So here again, there is a deep connection between the two disciplines, I think.
Very interesting. Lobson.
And I'd like to convey some of the extremely important points that His Holiness made, which is when we talk about certainty and investigate a certain phenomena, according to Buddhism, there are two types of truth: the conventional truth and ultimate truth. But when we talk about uncertainty, nature of scientific knowledge, it seems to be that you are looking for something intrinsically existent truth. And when you see that it is possible that it can be refuted, you totally kind of throw away that truth. But according to Buddhism, when you investigate conventional truth, you just leave it as existing conventionally. Within
Buddhist tradition. Because I think the identification is all right. I think something identification about the valid knowledge in the Pramana Vatika Karika and Dignas, you see, there the individual belief nobody knows, but according to their writing, you see, they belongs to Sotantic, half Sotantic, and Chittamantra, not Madhyamika. So about the very nature of phenomena, object as well as subject, you see, there are sort of different view. So now Madhyamika philosophy, you see, nothing objectively exists. Madhyamika, particularly Prasankika Madhyamika. So, Yerasadi, Jigden Tabakon, Yerasmato, Patatu, and Penny,
So according to Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophical school, when we talk about something existing, it has to be understood in terms of how that thing exists by way of convention, but we cannot actually have something which exists absolutely from the objectively.
Therefore, I think way to description about reality, according Pramana Vatika Karika, take for granted there is something independent, absolute nature. So these are more complicated. So go to deeper, more complication. and we have to test through practice. Then you gain certain sort of conviction. Oh, this philosophical view is actually counter force about our ultimate ignorance. Only through experience, then you will get firm conviction. So that's sort of the analyze, then test, experiment. So final sort of answer come from experience. So experience is a little bit mystery and difficult.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Scott.
Thank you. I enjoyed those presentations on the epistemology, the methodology of Buddhist science, Western science, but I couldn't help think that there was something importantly missing in the characterization of Western science, namely creativity and playfulness. And I wanted to know from the speakers what they think is the role of creativity, play in the conception, execution, and interpretation of the science that they do.
In Buddhism, so.
Yes, thank you very much for the important point. And now I would like to talk a little bit about inductive reasoning as well.
Let's answer this question. Creativity and playfulness. Is there a role of creativity? What role does that play in Buddhist science?
I really don't have a word.
I think in Buddhist tradition, Buddhist text, the creativity by the this morning, sentient being, still we do not understand the real demarcation, sentient or non-sentient. But in any way, you see, we call sentient being because there is a nature, feeling of self. With that, the feeling of, let's say, the pains and pleasure. So by nature, we want so happiness or pleasure, do not want suffering. That's the key factor. All evolution, we working. Even animal, because of that desire. But then gradually, I think the sea animal eventually reach land. Then you see, they want to reach quickly. So then I think because of that desire and also some other element, the wind eventually you see come. So we can say that. But unsentient being, where? Unsentient, non-sentient being, the evolution, what is the causes? Then Buddhists may have the vague answer, that's karma. Long cheche simche yeba yinza, te lewangi in nejukabatu chabri scorbada. Dear the river that Puja Ringuchane, that ships have got all. Kopege Kasure, Toma Kake wedding Kasoda. At the beginning, I think at least this is the recent, I think within 5 billions of years, the world start, sun develop, then the solar develop. So beginning, I think including Mars or I think Moon, these are just planet with water, like sea. Then gradually sea dry, then earth come. Then eventually you see life. I think during the time of the ocean, there may be some sort of sentient being. But then eventually dry. Why? How? Of course, the Buddhist answer, Buddhist explanation, karma, is a little bit too vague. So I think scientific sort of explanation, how develop the non-sentient, like rocks or these, how it developed. Why? Why? I think very difficult. How the scientist can explain. Question of why, no answer. The simple answer is God. Like that.
About creativity? Can play with, yeah.
Yeah, I personally think that creativity it's not very given a very big importance in here in this monastery. I personally feel that as youth, especially in the West, creativity is, but so I'm not talking about that. I want to talk about a little bit about the playfulness in the monastic, curriculum, if I may say. So you may have seen the monks doing, the monastics doing debates here in the debate courtyards, and their playfulness certainly takes a role in, because during such debates, while debating about very serious points of the Buddhist philosophical thoughts, and still you can make jokes, you can share jokes with each other, and so many other things and these things make the debate sessions very lively and very, enjoyable. So I think there it takes a role there.
One final remark here from Sonam.
I'd like to say something as he's already mentioned. According to the Buddhist epistemology, they say there is a existing intrinsic nature. In Sanskrit, it's called svabhava. Yeah, I have read some paper, paper written by some Western researchers, based on the Sanskrit literature. They say svabhava means intrinsic nature. So Nagarjuna and Dharmakirti, those scholars of Nalanda tradition, Nalanda, they always mentioned like emptiness of svabhava. Not so when they in Sanskrit when they read it like this, say like this, savadhamma svabhava shunyas. So in quantum mechanics they say also Niels Bohr said that there's a no objectively existing. Is it? In your slide also you mentioned, you say objective scientist. So I think maybe Niels Bohr might be a subjective scientist.
I think we have to leave that as a question because I'm getting the cut sign from the producer here, and I think we're going to have to close this session down. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been a very, very useful and meaningful conversation.
I think conventionally, yes, there is object and subject. If so we further investigate what object, what subject, you can't find. So I think we, both Buddhist logic and science both you should try to find what is the reality. But finally, we can't find because of Subhava.
Okay.
Subhava Shuddha, Savadhamma Subhava Shuddha, Subhava Shuddha, Rangshi Thakwa, Rangshi Meba. Of course, I cannot claim I have some sort of deeper experience, but there is some small experience that through experience, now I have sort of 100% conviction that wisdom which understand ultimate reality, nothing there, that really direct sort of antidote, counterforce about wrong perception. Actually, now that one scientist, one American scientist, Aaron Beck, I think several times I mentioned Aaron Beck. When I first met, more than 10 years ago, his age already 84-year-old. He's not a religious person. No question, no Buddhist, not Buddhist. See, he, a scientist, dealing with people who mentally some sort of, because of the unrest, because of disturbances due to anger. At least I think he helped, he deal with such sort of patient, I think at least 3-4 decades. Then he take one conclusion. He made one conclusion. When we develop anger, I think we Tibetan as well as Mongolian are quite similar, quite tough. So when we develop anger, the object appears something very negative. But he says that negativeness, 90% of that negativeness is mental projection. So that's exactly Nagarjuna stated that. So that, another word, that sort of, I think, mental projection develop on the basis of you believe or on the basis of appearances. Appearances is false. False. Reality, no juguti. Rengshing to meba.
Reality,
he says,
reality means that there are nothing that has intrinsic or objective existence.
But appearance, completely different. Appearance or something objectively there. So that is the basis of exaggeration. 90% of mental projection develop. So once you develop, nothing exists independently from the object, then these false, or say the view or perception reduce. So anger, hate, anger, and attachment become very weak. So that's we Buddhists, this philosophy use for counterforce these destructive emotion. So I'm wondering, I think once I mentioned to you or not, no? I have sort of what's the keen interest of the desire or interest. Those quantum physicists not only sort of understand intellectual level, but fully convinced nothing objectively exists. Such scientists, they are not thinking that theory in order to reduce a negative emotion, but simply because of that conviction, now nothing objectively exists. There, so the emotional level might be some differences. That I'm wondering. Of course, any scientist, if you have some sort of interest, please, on behalf of me, please observe those genuine the quantum physicists in their daily life. You see, their sort of emotion, rough emotion, same or a little bit less. That I really want.
That's a prediction.
Then I think there one story in Lhasa. You see, Kasa, Kasa.
The place for the circumambulation.
So someone, you see, went there, and then beside the road, there's someone, you see, looks, meditate, and that person is asked, what you are doing, what meditation? He say, meditate on tolerance. Then that person use very negative word to that person. He immediately responds. The
word is a little bit nasty, because when he was asked, what are you meditating? He said, I'm meditating on patience. Then he said, if you are meditating on patience, you eat my shit.
Then he immediately responds,
Then he said, you take that back.
Therefore, similarly, those who say, I think scientists who fully convinced nothing objectively exists, then, you see, try to create some sort of irritation. Then, whether his reaction, normal way or some differences, we can see. Now you promise. You promised me investigation. This, so thank you. Then if you come back with certain result, then I will give you some matter. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.